you're in Miami. You're muted, Elaine. Do you want to unmute? Okay. Yeah.
Sorry, we were on mute.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So where do you live? In Miami?
In West Palm Beach.
Yes.
And where do you live?
In LA, not far from San Diego.
Okay, we're gonna jump into it. We'll leave some time for schmoozing at the end, but for everybody who's joining us on YouTube too, I want to make sure that we get started. But I want to start first of all by wishing everybody a Shavua Tov. I hope it's a great start to your week for the first few minutes we've had.
Shavua Tov.
Shavua Tov. And the question I want to open with is what is so special about the land of Israel that should be the land that God promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and to their ancestors afterwards. Really, what is it that makes the land of Israel so great? And hello, Kevin on YouTube. Good to see you. Welcome back. In this week's Torah portion, we had a few verses which might have hinted to what makes the land of Israel so great. And I want to point us to two that we're going to look at tonight. If you have a Tanakh, we're going to look at chapter 8, verses 7 through 10. And then we're going to look at the end. We're going to look at chapter 11, verse 12. Before we jump into the text, tonight is a little different. So if you've been at our Hasidut classes for the last many weeks, we've been studying out of a book called the Kedushat Levi. That's Levi Yitzchak Miberdichev. He is a third-generation Hasidic rabbi, and his works, at least in the Kedusha Levi, I would classify as kind of like practical Hasidus. It is not, explicitly Kabbalistic in the sense of how does God emanate into the world. He doesn't go into those deeper questions for the most part. It's more about how to do deveikut, how to go about living a life where you are connecting yourself to God at every moment. Now, we're going to study a text completely different tonight. We're going to study this from this book called the Ma'or V'Shamesh. This is Rabbi Colonius Kalman Halevi Epstein. He is a fourth-generation Hasidic rabbi, so later. So we're talking, he died in about 1820. He had just a little bit of biography so you can understand what we're getting into tonight. Levi Yitzchak was in a small town called Berdichev. He ended up there because he was kicked out numerous times by his opponents, the Mitnagdim, who really did not like Hasidic Judaism. Now, Rabbi Colonius Kalman Epstein, who we're going to read tonight, decided to set up shop in Krakow. Now, that was a really risky move because at the time, the opponents of the Hasidim, the Mitnagdim they called themselves, were really the power force in Judaism. And so this guy decides to set up shop in a main city, in a huge town, in a place where there's lots of Mitnagdim, lots of opponents to Hasidic Judaism. So his teaching, he had to kind of step it up a level. So he brought a lot more Talmud. He brought a lot more Zohar, a lot more of the science of Kabbalah into his Hasidic work, which is why we don't use him so much. It's a much harder text to access because it requires a lot more background in the Talmud and in the Zohar. So if you're just joining us for the first time tonight, Rosa and Faith, if tonight I kind of stumble in explaining the science of how God emanates from the upper Sphirot to the lower Sphirot, it's because I'm just learning it myself. It's complicated. The Zohar is complicated. And then I promise next week we get into more practical Hasidut, about doing Dveikut, about, kind of figuring out ways in our own life to connect to God on a deeper level. But tonight, the reason I wanted to do this is because there's this amazing gematria play that he does at the end of this chapter. Gematria is it's where every Hebrew letter has also a numerical equivalent, and I've never seen a more creative use of gematria ever. So I'm really excited to share that with you. It is the reason that we're looking into the Ma'or V'Shamish tonight. So let's start with chapter 8, verse 7. I'll read it to us. It says, "For the Lord your God is bringing you into a good land, a land with streams and springs and fountains issuing from plain and hill, a land of wheat and barley, of vines, figs, and pomegranates, a land of olive trees and honey, a land where you may eat food without stint, where you will lack nothing, a land whose rocks are iron, and from whose hills you can mine copper." Okay, that's the verse we're starting with. And so now the Ma'or V'Shamish is going to comment on that verse. I'm going to skip this one part where he asks the question. He says, why go into all the details about what the land of Israel has to offer? First of all, if it lacks nothing, why then are you telling me things that it has? Just tell me it lacks nothing. Second of all, if you're really trying to tell me how great a land is, don't tell me that its mountains are iron and copper. Tell me that its mountains have gold and silver in them. That would be, more, that's more expensive than iron and copper. So he sets it up and he says, what's the deal with this verse? Okay, so he says, "V'nireh, ki hakadosh baruch hu hivtiach la'avod Eretz Yisrael." We know that God promised our ancestors the land of Israel. Ubevadai lo hivticham machmat shehi Eretz Shmina. He didn't promise it because it's a fatty land, a land that has a lot of natural resources. Ke'etzlam lo haya chashuv lem'uma, because they, our ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, could not care less about if the land, had lots of natural resources, gold and silver. That's not what they were after. Tavot halam hazeh. They didn't care about the desires of this world. Rak shehem hayu mevakshim kemit moniyut. They only sought after the hidden things. Et avdut Hashem yitzbarach, specifically in serving God. V'hayu chofatzim umishtokikim mayanot ha'chochma. What they were after, what they really desired, were wellsprings of wisdom. V'hainu ha'ba'erot shechafru ha'avod. Shechafru et mayanot ha'chochma. And behold, when the Torah tells us that our ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, dug wells, what they really mean is wells of wisdom. Mayanot ha'chochma. Ra'a hakadosh baruch hu godel teshukotam lahasig mayanot ha'chochma. God saw that they desperately wanted to achieve these wellsprings of wisdom. V'nigle alehem, and God revealed God's self to them. Va'amar lahem, and he said to them, Sheyelchu la'eretz Canaan, go to the land of Canaan, ki avira de Eretz Yisrael mechakim, because just the air of the land of Israel makes one wise. Mipnei, and why is that the case? He's saying, just to pause for a second, what he's saying to sum up so far is that so far the promise of the land of Israel was not about how wonderful the land is, but it's about the fact that our ancestors who sought wisdom and who sought God and a connection to God would be able to do so in the best possible way in the land of Israel. And I love this concept that just the air of the land of Israel makes one wise. There's something about being there that elevates one intellectually as well as spiritually. Mipnei, and why is this, he says? Mipnei shehu mul eretz Yisrael milmala. He says the land of Israel on earth is, it's contrary to the land of Israel up above. He's imagining there's two lands of Israel. There's the one below, and there's an upper land of Israel. Shehi Eretz Elyonah. It's an upper land of Israel, he says. Shehi Neged Ma'anot HaChochma. And that upper land of Israel, the upper Israel, is really right next to those well springs of wisdom. Visham Tuchu Lahasig B'Nakel Ma'anot HaChochma. For there in the land of Israel, it's possible and even easier to achieve those well springs of wisdom. V'hitiach HaKadosh Baruch Hu lahem l'tet otam livneihem. And God promised to give this land to them and to their children, kedei shegam hem yasigu ma'anot hachochma, that they too will achieve those well springs of wisdom. Umipnei shehi mul eretz Yisrael shilmala. And because it is directly opposite to the upper land of Israel. Lechen, hayu yordim letocha kol hahashpaot tovot, machmad zeh hu hameula shebe'artzo. And because of that, because it is directly opposite to the upper land of Israel, the land of Israel itself gets all of the overflow of God. As God, and we'll see this again in a second. And this is the part that there's a science in Kabbalah about how God emanates through the 10 Sefirot into the world. And it's not simple. And he says when this happens, as God emanates into the world, the land of Israel gets the overflow. It's the first place on planet Earth that receives any divine energy as God comes into the world. And because of that, it is elevated above all the other lands. So that's his setup here. The setup is that why is it that that God promised the land of Israel to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? He says because Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob showed a deep desire to find wisdom and to seek God. And I want to also hone in on the order of events here. First, Abraham, let's just take Abraham. So first, Abraham had to show that he wanted a deep connection with God, that he was searching for wisdom. Then God saw that. And because God saw that Abraham was searching, it's kind of the you give an inch, God gives a mile saying. Where here, Abraham was reaching out, really devoting his life to finding wisdom and finding God. And then God sees that and tells him, go to the land of Canaan, because that's what you're seeking, you'll find there. Although you can, serve me anywhere, this is the place that receives my divine energy first, says God. And this is the place where just the air itself, in the air itself, you'll find wisdom. Not because there's gold and silver, but because there you can find the Ma'anot HaChochma, these well springs of wisdom. Okay, that's step one. That's going to be the setup for this great piece of Gematria that we're going to read in a second. But before we go on to his second comment, I'm going to open it up for questions, thoughts, and concerns, either on the YouTube chat or here on Zoom. Okay. Oh, yes, Rosa. Oh, wait, you're muted. I can't hear you yet.
Okay. When it says that the land has iron and copper, I thought of it as tools to be able to build a city rather than gold and silver, which is a little bit more esoteric. Maybe it's to decorate the temple or vanity, but those are things that are necessary to build.
Yes. Yeah. I'm really glad he pointed that out. I also thought about that too. So what Rosa said, for those who couldn't hear her on YouTube, is that the reason that Rosa saw for the land having iron and copper is because it's useful. You can build tools out of it. Gold and silver, as Rosa points out, is more esoteric. It has no intrinsic use outside of being, valuable. But iron and copper, you can use and actually do something with. Notably, even though I think that's a very reasonable answer, the Maor V'Shamash does not go that route, because his goal is obviously to point to something. It's interestingly enough, he goes the esoteric route. Instead of saying that, look at iron and copper, which is so useful, he says something even more esoteric. He says, no, it doesn't even matter what's in the land of Israel. What matters is its location, and that's what makes it special. Yeah.
Well, Reb Shmuel, if you don't mind, later in history, gold and silver are used, obviously, to build the Beit HaMikdash.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
At this time, they are considered less important. But later in our history, that's what's used. Dafka, all the tools, like Rosa said, all the tools are used, and the gold and silver are used.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, Steve taking the historic approach, saying that this time actually iron and copper is more valuable than gold and silver. Thank you, Steve. I'm going to take the Maor V'Shamash approach, which is to say that the reason it's here is to show us something deeper, that what's important about the land of Israel is that this place, through when you're there, you connect to God, you connect to wisdom in a deeper way. Now, all those answers are great and correct. Okay, so we're going to go to the last comment we're going to read tonight. And when I say last comment, there's pages and pages here. That was one small, little... I'll show you what we're reading here. This is what the book looks like. This is what we just read, just from down here to here. So you can kind of get a sense of how dense these texts can be. And now we're actually skipping ahead to the very last paragraph in this, for this parsha. And we're going to turn ahead in our Tanakh to chapter 11, verse 12. And I have to say, if you do have a Tanakh or a way to look at this verse, it'll make the gematria click a little easier if you have some visual. I'll read it to you. I'm going to read it to you in the Hebrew, and I'm going to read it to you in the English. In the Hebrew, it's Eretz Asher Hashem. It's a further description of the land of Israel. Again, chapter 11, verse 12. It says, Eretz Asher Hashem Elohecha Doreshota. Tamid Einei Hashem Elohecha Ba Merishit Hashana Ad Acharit Hashana. It's a land in which the Lord your God looks after, on which the Lord your God always keeps his eye, from year's beginning to year's end. Now let's see what the Maor V'Shamash does with this. So I want to point out one... He points out that it's superfluous. He doesn't think that you need the verses about Shana. He says, just say it's Tamid Einei Hashem Elohecha Ba. Just say that God's eyes are always on it. You don't need to add Mereshit Hashana Ad Acharit Hashana, from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. That was already taken care of in the word always. So that kind of superfluidity is going to be his key, to this comment he's going to say. He says, okay, Eretz Asher Hashem Elohecha Doresh Ota. So Einei Hashem Elohecha Ba Merishit Hashana Ad Acharit Hashana. So that's the verse. He says, Yesh Lahavin. There's what to understand from this. Ma Lashon Einei Hashem. What is the deal with this? What is the deal with this language? Einei Hashem, the eyes of God. V'hayadai ba'omru, and it was enough that we should have said Doresh Ota Tamid, that God keeps watch on it always. Mereshit Hashana Dacharit Hashana, that was already too much. Omnam, ha'inyan hu, so this is the essence. She'artzenu hakdosha, mikavenet keneged eretz ha'elyona. So we already read this in the last section. That our Holy Land is connected with the upper land of Israel, the one from which the well springs of wisdom flow, if you remember from the last verse. And that upper land of Israel, he says, is Midat Malchut Shamayim, is the has the quality of Malchut Shamayim. So this is a technical Kabbalistic term. You know, and in learning about the Sphirot, I can tell you Malchut is the lowest of all the Sphirot. It acquires godliness through the other 9 Sphirot. So there's 9 Sphirot, you know, from Keter all the way down to Malchut, and Malchut being the lowest. So there's multiple times that emanation happens. You know, there's Malchut Shamayim, which I believe here is saying that there's God emanating down to this upper land of Israel, and then from there's 10 more Sphirot that go down to the lower land of Israel. And to make matters more complicated, this will be important in a second, each of the Sphirot have within them all of the other Sphirot. So, for instance, Malchut has within it all of the Sphirot. Keter, the very top one, has within it all of the Sphirot. And emanation happens on a micro scale in each of the Sphirot as God emanates through each one from the upper to the lower. If that's complicated, it's because Kabbalah is a very complicated science. Again, one that I'm, just starting to learn now. Even though I really shouldn't. I'm not 40 yet. But by the time I get to 40, I want to, start really learning it. So anyway, he says, the reason we talked about this, he says, the land of Israel is in accordance with the upper land, which has the Midah of Malchut, Shamayim, it's a lower upper sphere. It's the lowest sphere of all the upper spheres. Okay, Vehine, Kishehamalchut mekabelet hashpa'a meha-eser sphirot. When Malchut, when that lowest sphere acquires God's emanation from all of the other sphirot, as Eretz Yisrael, Shehi mekavenet negdah, Eretz Yisrael, which is directly opposite Eretz HaElyonah, this upper land, mekabelet gam ken kol hashpaot tovot, also acquires this overflow of godly energy. We read that in the last comment too, that's what makes Eretz Yisrael special, the land of Israel special, is that as God emanates into the world, you get a little overflow and it lands in the land of Israel because it's directly opposite where this whole process is happening. Okay, Ki Eretz Yisrael, Hi Rishona lekabelet hashpa'a hayored milmala. For the land of Israel, it's the first place on earth that acquires this overflow that comes down from above. V'zeh remez hakatuv, and this is the hint of the verse. Okay, now for the gematria. Here we go. Einei Hashem, the eyes of God. Ki ayin yud nun in gematria. That is 5 times God's name. God's name, Yud Hey Vav Hey, is 26. 26 times 5 equals, hold on, 130. Here, we'll do it like this. 130. So that's 26 times 5. That's God's name 5 times. And Ayin, Aleph Yud Nun, is 130. Let's check that. Yes, it is. Okay, and so hold that, he says. Okay, and I lost my place a little bit, but that's okay. I'm going to go back to it. Okay, and Bet Einayim, he says, and then you have 2 eyes, Einei Hashem, so that is 10 God's names. So what does it mean, the eyes of God? He says, actually, this is 10 names of God, which are in accordance with the 10 Sphirot. Now, the reason this makes sense Kabbalistically is because God's name in the Zohar is actually a process from the upper sphere to the lower sphere. Yud being Keter, Hey being Bina, Chochma, and Chochma, Bina, and Da'at, and then Vav being Tiferet to Yisod, and then the Hey being Malchut. I know that was a lot, but suffice it to say, he says that these Einei Hashem, Einei are 2 eyes. 2 eyes equal 260, Ayin plus Ayin, and that equals God's name 10 times, which is in accordance with the 10 Sefirot. So let's read the verse so far. Instead of reading the eyes of God are always on it, read instead the 10 Sefirot of God are always on it. First part of the Gematria. Then he says, V'shana, and the word Shana, Gam ken Gematria Sfira. He says the word Shana has the same Gematria as Sfira. And I'll show you here. I have a great Gematria app. I highly suggest you get it. So, I'll show it here. Shana, you see, is 355. I'll show it down here. 355. Can't really see it. Shana is 355. And the word Sfira, look at that. 355. Sfira. Sfira, 355. Okay, so instead of reading Shana, he says read Sfira. So instead of saying the eyes of God are always on it from the beginning of the year to the end of the year, instead we can read it as saying the 10 Sefirot of God are always on it from the first Sephira to the last Sephira. From the first all the way down to the 10th. I thought that was the most creative use of Gematria I've ever seen. The 10 names of God, that Shana is Sephira. He's saying, what he's doing is he's flawlessly, if you count Gematria as flawless, proven the idea that God emanates to the land of Israel through the Sefirot. Both, using all of, his exposition that we've had so far, and this Gematria at the end, where he actually says from the first sphere to the last sphere. It's not even a stretch. The Shana, I'll give it to you. Maybe the Einei Hashem, the eyes of God. Ayin Yod Nun being 180, and then 2 eyes being 260, and 10 names of God. Maybe that might have been a stretch. But Shana and Sefira is very, very simple. They just both equal 355. From the first Sefira to the last Sefira. Okay, and I'll just finish his text here. V'zeh einei Hashem, daika ratzeh lomar, kol eser Sefirot. For the eyes of God, that, what we mean to say is really the 10 Sefirot. Bereshit Hashana ad acharit Hashana, from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. Ratzeh lomar, bereshit hamadrega ad Sefira ha'asirit. He says from the very highest levels all the way down to the 10th sphere. V'zehu ad acharit Hashana, and that's what we mean with by the end of the year. We actually mean the lowest, the 10th sphere. Shehi mekabelet kol hahashpa'a v'yoredet, because it acquires all of that overflow of God that comes down, lemidat malchut, to that lowest sphere of malchut, v'haven, and that's how he ends it. He says, and understand this. That's how he says it at the end. Okay. Yeah, so this is why we don't always look into the Ma'or V'Shamesh. Okay, this is why we work with our practical, Hasidic teacher, Levi Yitzchak Miberdicha. But this Gematria was just too good to pass up. It says, just to review, we have this verse, the eyes of God are on it all the time, from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. But because you say Einei Hashem, you can point to that as 10 times God's name. And Shana being Sefira, you can say that the 10 Sefirot of God are on it all the time, from the upper sphere to the lower sphere. Pretty amazing, great Kabbalistic Gematria text. And, okay, we've answered the question, absolutely. What makes the land of Israel so special? It's because this is the land that receives the overflow of godliness as God emanates into the world. And there we can find wisdom and connect with God in a unique way. Okay, I've now said too much, so I'm going to open it up if there's any questions either on Zoom or on YouTube.
I have a question.
Yes.
It is, okay, this is when the Israelites were going to enter the land of Canaan. But as we all know, through the ages, the Jewish people haven't been able to live in the land of Israel. And so how can you reconcile the fact that God is overflowing blessings, so to speak, into the land when we haven't been able to inhabit the land for all this time? And now we do, but okay, that's one part of it. And how are we to interpret this for the Jews that live in the diaspora?
Yeah, okay, so Rosa asked the $1 million question, which is, what do you do with a text like this when you're living in the diaspora? So I'll tell you an answer. I'll tell you what I think is an answer that comes from some of the Hasidut learning we've done so far, and then I'll tell you kind of a personal answer. So my first Hasidut teacher, Rabbi Mimi Feigelson, would kill me for not remembering which rabbi this was attributed to. But I remember early on when we had gone through all of the early Hasidic rabbis, and we shared a little bit of their teaching, there was one who said that it's actually easier to connect with God now in the diaspora than it would have been in the land of Israel. Because the land of Israel, the stakes are too high. You have, at the time of the temples, you had God living in a particular place. You had God inside the temple. And in the land of Israel, maybe you can feel that presence a little bit when you visit the Kotel or in the Old City. After the destruction of the temple, this rabbi said we could connect with God. We connect with God even easier, because he said a king. Oh, I want to make sure I get this right, Rosa. He said, let me just think for a second, so I don't want to mess up this teaching. He said, he said a king when he's at his home, when he's in his castle, it takes a lot to draw him out. You have to be a serious dignitary or give the king a good reason to leave the castle in order to go. But when the king is on the road, traveling from here to there, he'll stop in to any place that he finds basically suitable. And so too, when we're in exile, there's this idea that God is in exile with us. And now we can connect to God here in exile, through our basic keeping of mitzvot, through being, decent, good people, whereas in the land of Israel, when there was a temple, when God is in, the palace, so to speak, it takes a lot more to draw God out. Now that teaching is I want to add in direct, contradiction to what we read tonight, where in the land of Israel, there's just a natural overflowing of God. But I think that's okay. I think that's, one answer, to it. But I want to also share that the struggle of diaspora is real. It's not just us. In the Talmud itself, the rabbis wonder, why don't all Jews live in the land of Israel? Why are we living in Bavel? And they try to justify it to themselves. Look, I think that living in the land of Israel is, it is a unique place to connect with God. I know when I'm there, I feel, elevated, but, here in the diaspora, it doesn't mean that we can't, and it doesn't mean that, we don't have that same access to God. This is why we have the mitzvot. This is why, our, these Hasidic rabbis, who also all lived in diaspora. Remember, the Me'or V'Shamash is teaching this from Krakow. They emphasize, dveikut and the possibility of seeking God and finding God even outside of the land of Israel. Even if they thought it was easier to do so in the land of Israel, they didn't deem it impossible. In fact, none of the Hasidic rabbis who will study lived in the land of Israel themselves, though they all stressed the possibility and even the obligation of Jews in the diaspora, to achieve dveikut, to pray fervently, to keep mitzvot, to keep God first and foremost in their minds, no matter what they were doing, mitzvah or not. if they were just going about their daily lives. And through that, one can access God even when not in the land of Israel. But you have to imagine, what the Maor of Hashamish was thinking too when he was teaching this. He doesn't want his students to go to Krakow, and he doesn't expect to go to Israel from Krakow, and he doesn't expect them to. I think we've been struggling with this for a long time, what it means to be diaspora Jews. And to me, the best answer I've found has been through Devekut, through keeping God first and foremost. We can develop that intense connection with God. That I think he's talking about finding the land of Israel. And don't forget, he just says that Israel is the first land to get that overflow, but still it doesn't mean that godliness doesn't find it, its way, to the other four corners of the earth, so to speak. Yeah. And the truth is, I don't think we've ever found a sufficient answer, is the other side. In the Talmud, our rabbis try very hard to say that Bavel has maybe some of the levels of holiness that the land of Israel does. They say maybe because it's a place of deep Torah learning, and Israel is not, that we have a deeper connection to God. But they never really succeed, and they continue to try to justify their own living outside the land of Israel. So Rosa, I'll also mention you're not alone in this, and that we do and have been connecting to God in the diaspora for a long time. And that doesn't make the land of Israel less special, and doesn't make the diaspora an impossible place to find spirituality.
Reb Shmuel, if you will allow me.
Yes.
I also want to point out that after living many years in Israel and experiencing, also the diaspora and Israel, I will say that, first of all, the holiness will always be in Eretz Yisrael. It's not going to be, more holy in Bavel or more holy in New York or LA. It doesn't matter. What does matter is, one of the major reasons why we will find throughout history that our Golei Hador, if you want to call them that, from centuries ago, were always in Galut, was because they had to help the community work harder at getting to that level of holiness that Eretz Yisrael is already at. And I know many, many people observant, I'm not referring to Orthodox, I'm saying observant at all levels, whatever that may be, who really do spend much more time and effort when they're in Galut, trying to work harder at getting to that level than they are when they are in Eretz Yisrael. Because everybody sits back and says, I'm here in the holy world.
Yeah.
Why? Why? And if anything, it's just as important in Israel as it is.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. So Steve, for those of you on YouTube who couldn't catch every word, Steve pointed out, after living in both the land of Israel and in America, for both for significant periods of time, that Israel, you can't deny that it does have an added level of holiness that you can feel. But in the diaspora, we actually have a responsibility to each other, actually, to lift each other up in a different way, because we have to work harder. And we do have to work harder. And I'll tell you an example. I've talked to a number of secular Israelis, like, oh, what do you mean you're secular? Oh, yeah, we're at home with Shabbat. We keep Passover. When it's Rosh Hashanah, we get the round cake. We don't eat on Yom Kippur. We sit in our sukkah, and they call themselves secular. In America, in Israel, there's just a natural. It's easier to. I mean, right now, it's really different right now, I have to say. But actually, and I want to point out, the Maor of Hashamish's time in 1820, a Jew in the land of Israel was not like that. It wasn't like everybody wishes you Shana Tova on Rosh Hashanah. Like, you go there and you're really struggling. So I think for him, it's almost, nowadays we can even feel maybe, the natural, gravity toward God now in a different way. But for him, he really meant it as like there was a real godly energy flowing there, with or without, the millions of Jews. There's a natural godly energy that flows in there. Okay,
And
last comment. Unless Faith, you have a comment. Okay, yeah, Mom, go for it. Last comment.
So last time I was in Israel for Sukkot, your point is so interesting, because even if I was somebody that never knew what a sukkah was, okay, if sitting in a sukkah is in itself a mitzvah, or eating a meal in a sukkah is a mitzvah, I could be the most secular Israeli and go to any kosher restaurant I wanted that time, and I almost had no choice but to sit outside and eat in the sukkah, which was outside of the restaurant.
Yeah.
Even if I would have to look hard to find a place to eat.
You really, yeah. It's hard.
Well, you know what? You're also what you said. I'm sorry, Shmuel. What you said also. In general, the average Israeli. I'm sorry. The absolute majority of Israelis, including most of the secular Israelis, will build sukkot for their children. Even if they're totally, secular and non-religious, but they want their children to grow up with certain basic knowledge.
Yeah,
and that's very important to them.
Yeah, and I do want to hold before we all part ways. That really the reality that the land of Israel that the Ma'or V'Shamash is talking about with this godly overflow, was not the land of Israel we see today. And I wonder, for him, all the more so, obviously, with what's happening there today, where you can feel like you just lit really, he said, he captured it perfectly, which he says, there's something in the air. He says, Avira Yisrael mechakim. He said, the air of the land of Israel makes one wise. And I would say just the air there, has a divine energy to it. And when I lived in Jerusalem, every day I woke up, I knew I was in the land of Israel. I knew I was in Jerusalem. There was just like an attention that the air itself brought to it. And, whether or not you have the millions of Israelis building Sukkot for their kids, or it's a place inhabited entirely, by, an Arab population, the land of Israel itself has a unique connection to God, he says, through what he calls Eretz Elyonah, this upper land that it's connected to. Okay, we've gone on much longer than we usually do. This is a great topic, though. Maybe at some point we'll come back to the land of Israel in Hasidic texts. Boy, we'll see how long it takes to put that curriculum together. So everybody on YouTube, thanks for joining us, and I'm going